Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Legatum Institute. My name is Howell Williams, and I look after the cultural programs here, and you can read about those programs in some detail if you go to www.li.com. Why is it that certain societies, states, nations, individuals, companies, businesses start to become successful, thereby stealing the march on other organizations and individuals who may have been successful but start to decline? Why do organizations and individuals perhaps never attain intellectual depth, cultural creativity, economic prosperity? Well, these are the sort of questions that preoccupy, I dare say, historians of societies and states and nations at all times and in all ages. They are also the concern of the Legatum Group, of which we, as an institute, form a part, and which is headquartered at Dubai, and whose philanthropic energies and cultural, intellectual creativity spans the globe, whether in the case of Legatum at MIT, that studies entrepreneurship, the END Fund that works to eradicate neglected diseases, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, or in the work of the Freedom Fund that campaigns against the recent rise in human trafficking and forced labor. Here at the Institute, the Legatum Institute, we are particularly interested in and we research the causes of free market, prosperity and cultural advance in that area, both institutionally and personally. These questions of how and why certain societies rise and others, comparatively speaking, fall, come very much into focus in the lecture program, the third of which is being delivered here this evening, on the history of capitalism. A brief note on the story so far. We've looked at Islam in the early Middle Ages and the possible sources for some areas of capitalist creativity in the Arabia of the 7th century as it burst out of the peninsula to new forms of growth along North Africa and the Middle East. In the last lecture of this series, the most recent lecture of this series, David Abulafia came from Cambridge to talk about the economic creativity of the Mediterranean world and how it began to wane and began to be taken over by the new world explored by the Portuguese navies and armies of conquest also, it must be said, in the Eastern Atlantic, the beginning of the Atlantic economy that made our world. And in the third lecture, which is being delivered here this evening by Victoria Bateman of Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, notable always as a seminary of great historians, we will be looking at the world of the early modern period, extending very capaciously conceived from the middle of the 15th century to the middle of the 17th century. And there is one particular story of excellence and rise to stellar status that preoccupies both Victoria and will be of great concern to ourselves here this evening. The rise to greatness of the Kingdom of England and of the United Provinces, which then became known as the Dutch Republic. Victoria is one of those very rare historians who has the ability to jump over the confessional divides, as it were, that divide one branch of the historical profession from another, but she can also dig deep beneath that historical landscape. She also belongs to another, even more select group of historians, of those who have been content to be portrayed in that art form known to the history of Western art as the nude. A recent example of that genre being on display at the moment in the Mall galleries and having excited a good deal of excited controversy in circles not exclusively academic. Victoria is remarkable because for her the study of history is not just, as it were, an academic thing. It is personal and heartfelt. And her nude is the study of the human form and of the woman who is not to be understood as a sexualized creature. She also is to be understood as a member of another group, even more select group, because there is only one other woman in this room who has been portrayed in the nude. With that introduction, I introduce you to Victoria Bateman.
You'll see that I'm a little bit smaller than Highwell, so I am here up on a pedestal, so I can see you all. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and indeed for inviting me. I'm delighted to be speaking to you here this evening. Now, for many who lived through it, the early modern period was an age of turmoil, both in political and religious terms. However, it was also a period of dramatically changing fortunes, which shifted the economic balance in a direction that's brought us to the modern age. For the first time in history, Europe began to challenge the technological and economic dominance that the East had possessed for millennia, whilst within Europe, the axis of economic power shifted decisively out of the Mediterranean and towards the northwest. The Dutch economy underwent a spectacular golden age, and England was firmly on the road to the Industrial Revolution. In this lecture, we'll examine how and why the balance of power shifted so decisively, how the northwest of Europe came to overtake the Mediterranean, and with it, how Europe came to overtake the East. We'll consider the factors that historians have traditionally emphasised, including the rise of representative government, what we might think of today as democracy, and the development of free markets. And we'll go on to look at some new explanations, including Joel Mokyer's enlightenment theory, as put forward in his recent book, An Enlightened Economy, and Robert C. Allen's high wage theory, as discussed in his book, The British Industrial Revolution in Global Perspective. Now, as we'll see, at the root of the Northwest's success in each of these regards was a feminist wave which started 500 years before we commonly think, and which not only brought dramatic changes in the lives of young women, but which also provided foundations for economic growth in the economy. Feminism was not only good for women, it was good for the economy, and without it, the Western economies would not have been able to achieve the riches they possess today. Now let's start at the beginning with Europe's position in the world on the eve of the early modern period. From the perspective of the modern day, we tend to look back at history and assume that the West has always been best, that from the time of the ancient Greeks through to the modern day, all of the major technological and intellectual achievements in history were a result of the pioneering nature of Europeans. We're frequently told that the East is only catching up today as a result of adopting Western-style markets. However, this commonly accepted story is nothing but a myth. As historians of science now know, and as was revealed by a former master of my own college, Joseph Needham, for most of history, the East and not the West has been at the cutting edge. Most of the major technological achievements in history, beginning with settled farming, urbanization, and the written word, occurred outside of Europe. In fact, early European travellers marvelled at what they saw overseas, such as Marco Polo on his visits to the significantly larger and more sophisticated Chinese cities. Europe wasn't an innovator. In fact, for most of history, it was an imitator. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the regions of Europe that were most closely connected with the East, through Constantinople and along the Silk Road, including most notably Italy, were those parts of Europe that triumphed early on. The riches of cities such as Venice, seen so clearly in the paintings of Canaletto, were in part built on the back of monopoly trading privileges that allowed Italian merchants to source Eastern goods and then to sell them to European consumers at high prices. Now, over time, with that transfer of goods from east to west, also came a flow of knowledge. And by the end of the medieval period, it was clear that Europe was, in many ways, catching up with the East. The result was the Renaissance, where we see the images of Greek goddesses, life-size nude images, replacing those religious images of the baby Jesus on the walls of Italian villas. Now, this Renaissance was what the historian of science, Patricia Farrer, has called an intellectual fizz, no more visible, as I say, than in the arts, and centred very much on Italy. It was partly in response to the great riches on show in the Italian cities that navigators and kings elsewhere in Europe began a search for their own route to the east. Vasco da Gama for Portugal sailed along the coast of Africa and up into the Indian Ocean, breaking the back of the Italian monopoly and bringing Eastern goods back to Europe at lower prices than they'd previously been available. In contrast to the Portuguese, the Spanish tried to think outside of the box. they decided to find a back door to the east, travelling westwards across the globe. Little did they realise that along the path lay another big continent, the Americas. Whilst they found that the back door to China was firmly closed in this direction, they nevertheless found that a window opened, and that window appeared in the form of silver mines. The problem that European traders had always had in their connections with the East was that whilst Europeans had a great appetite for the fancy and exotic goods, including manufactured goods such as porcelains and textiles that were coming out of the East, there wasn't really very much that the East wanted in return, other than perhaps a little bit of metal and possibly a little bit of wool. And that led to a persistent trade deficit that limited Europe's ability to trade with the East. That problem was solved with the discovery of silver mines. It gave Europeans something to trade with Easterners in return for those desired products. So, with the discovery of silver, Europeans had the potential to import ever-growing quantities of goods from the East. And it's therefore perhaps unsurprising that in the first half of the 16th century, trade boomed. In fact, it was growing at around 2.4% per annum between 1500 and 1550. That's not far off the growth of trade that we've seen in the 20th century, which is around 3.4%. So you can see here that Europe's trade with the Americas and its trade with the East was fundamentally linked. And it's at this point that the global economy with Europe at its centre was in the process of being born. And it's also at this point that our story of the early modern period begins. At the start of the early modern period, as it had been for millennia, southern Europe was the richest part of the continent, in part due to those connections with the East. Now, whilst economic power was certainly shifting away from its traditional Italian heartland in response to the development of those new overseas connections, that shift was initially taking place within southern Europe, so from Italy to the Iberian Peninsula. However, Iberian success wasn't sustained for long. Much of the associated colonial trade was monopolised and regulated, and poorly developed markets at home, hampered by unfavourable geography such as mountainous terrain, and some would argue poor institutions, limited the extent to which the benefits being experienced in the port cities could penetrate inland into the majority of the economy. And without an internal dynamic, the Iberian economy soon stagnated, and any nascent industry that did exist soon found itself uncompetitive in response to the inflows of silver that pushed up prices at home. The lack of internal sources of growth in that region meant that as other economies began to enter the race for colonies and international connections, Spain and Portugal were not in a sufficiently strong position back at home to maintain their lead. Their economies were ultimately doomed. Now, perhaps the key institution that most historians have argued was holding back, let's say, the Spanish economy, was absolutism. And by that we mean the excessive power of an unelected monarch. Now, rising absolutism is argued to have beset much of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, which could be argued to have ushered in a more general economic decline across the continent, known as the 17th century crisis. Everywhere states were becoming stronger. Now, in theory, stronger states could actually aid the development of markets within the economy. They could, for example, help ensure a stable currency that's good for exchange in the economy. They could also help underwrite law and order, that's good for merchants' contracts. And they also had the power to work to eliminate internal barriers to trade, such as tolls, and to put in place infrastructure systems. However, a number of states initially developed in an absolutist direction in a way that used their power to actually undermine markets rather than to support them. And they did this through, for example, increasing fiscal pressures from heavy state expenditure, uncertainty over property rights, perverting the courts of justice, and religious intolerance. So, for example, in the fiscal domain, increasing conspicuous consumption at the court level, together with rising military expenses as the absolutists embarked on military campaigns, placed great pressure on a number of European countries' finances. Part of that pressure was born in the form of heavy taxation by those with the least political privilege and power, the less well-off small-scale producers and workers. The fiscal pressure also increased uncertainty regarding property rights and eroded the system of justice. By expropriating private property and using the courts to unfairly extract wealth, absolutists found a simple short-term solution to their fiscal woes. However, the longer-term consequence was an environment in which economic incentives to invest and innovate, were damaged. In England, the result was a standoff between the monarch and Parliament, which resulted in the civil wars in the middle of the 17th century. Now, through abusing property rights, disrespecting the law, and persecuting individuals on the basis of their religion, it can be argued that these absolutist states undermined market development at the national level. By creating interstate conflict that resulted in a series of wars, it can also be argued that they disrupted not only local trade but long-distance trade. Germany suffered particularly badly in the 17th century as a result of the 30 Years' War, which arguably had its origins in religious and interstate conflict. Poland also suffered in the early modern period as surrounding states sought to extend into the region, with the ensuing warfare having serious effects on trade. However, whilst much of Europe was experiencing the pain of the 17th century crisis, two economies ultimately managed to buck the trend: the Netherlands, followed by England. The performance of Northwest Europe in the early modern period looks remarkable when placed in a comparative European context. Whilst many other European economies were in decline, the Netherlands underwent a spectacular golden age in the 17th century, and England began its rise from backwater to the British Industrial Revolution. And the result was a full-scale reorientation of the axis of economic power away from the Mediterranean for the first time in history. Now, whilst we lack reliable data on economic growth for this period, what we do have are estimates of things like urbanisation, agricultural productivity, and wages, which allow us to place the economic performance of the Dutch and English economies in the context of the rest of Europe. We're going to look at urbanisation to begin with, and for those of you in this room, you can have a look at the screen. Now, what you can see here is at the start of the early modern period, the Netherlands already had one of the highest urbanisation rates in Europe, getting on for 30% of the population living in urban areas. However, England, the dotted line, had, the blue line here, England had one of the lowest, so not much over 5%. Now, what you'll notice is that over time, England's urbanisation rate is the one that changes the most, and so England goes from being towards the bottom of the graph at the beginning of the period to topping the graph by the end of the period. So that's where the most significant change is taking place in terms of that particular measure of economic development. Now, moving on to agricultural productivity, a second measure of economic performance, we can see that with the exception of Belgium at the start of the period, most of Europe had a very similar level of agricultural productivity to begin with. Subsequently, however, the Netherlands, which is the pink line, and England, which is the dark blue line, underwent agricultural revolutions and meant that by the end of the early modern period, there was a big gap in terms of agricultural productivity between the northwest of Europe and the rest of Europe, a gap that hadn't been so clear early on in the period. Now, our third measure of economic performance tells us what's happening to the standard of living. And here I want to look at unskilled workers, who were, of course, the majority in Europe. And I'm using Robert C. Allen's welfare ratios as an indicator of real wages. Now, the welfare ratio is a measure of how much people were earning, remember these are unskilled workers, relative to what it would have cost to meet basic needs: food, clothing, and shelter. Now here, a value above 1 indicates that families had extra income over and above their basic needs, assuming they worked 250 days a year. Whereas a value of less than 1 indicates that families would have had to cut back on their basic consumption of goods, such as food, or to work more than 250 days a year to meet the gap. Now, what you can see here is at the start of the early modern period, the standard of living, measured in terms of the welfare ratio, was relatively high compared with the rest of the period. Now, that's an effect of the Black Death that strikes in 1348 and wipes out up to a third of the population and means that workers are scarce in the economy. As a result of that, if you're working for a wage, you're able to command a higher wage. And so if you survived the Black Death, you were in the money. And hence we have what are relatively high wages as measured by the welfare ratio at the start of this period. Now you can see there is some variation within Europe, but it's relatively limited at the start of this period compared with what happens by the end. From 1500, wages start marching downwards in many parts of Europe, and that's in response to population recovering. So workers are no longer as scarce as they were before, can no longer command wages as high as they could after the Black Death. However, the exception is the northwest of Europe, which you can see at the top of the graph. Countries in the northwest of Europe managed to maintain that higher wage that sets in after the Black Death. And that leads to what Robert Allen calls a great divergence in wages within Europe by the end of the early modern period. So what we need to ask is what explains the success of the Northwest in this period as seen so visibly in these figures? Traditionally, historians have emphasized factors such as representative government, including the Netherlands booting out the Spanish powers and England's glorious revolution in 1688 that took power from the hands of an unelected monarch and put it into the hands of an elected parliament, more representative of the general population. These political changes supposedly helped to further the development of markets and trade in the economy through, for example, supporting property rights, which economic theory teaches us provides incentives for investment and innovation, and so economic growth. However, recent research, including my own, published in my book Markets and Growth in Early Modern Europe, has suggested that markets were not sufficient to explain the growth in the Northwest. Markets had existed for too long and in too many other parts of the world to explain Europe's rise in this period. As, for example, David Abulafia emphasized in the last lecture, commercialization was a central feature of parts of Europe in medieval times. And, as others have pointed out, merchant practices had a long history in the Middle East, India, and China. In fact, not only were goods markets already developing in Europe well before the early modern period, so were those for finance. The interest rate on private sector loans fell from around 30% in the 12th century to 5 or 6% by the 15th century. Hence, it seems clear that markets were nothing new. They had already come into existence, had already undergone a series of developments, and so are not enough to explain why Europe managed to overtake the East by the end of the early modern period. And in fact, in some ways, policy was working against and not in favour of the market in early modern England. So we like to think of Britain as being a free trade nation, but the English state pursued mercantilist policy from Tudor times right through to the 19th century, as Ha-Joon Chang has shown in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder. So instead of purely market-based explanations of economic success, economic historians have recently gone in search of other factors that could help explain the rise of the Northwest and with it the rise of Europe. The first of these is the Enlightenment. Now, according to Joel Mokyr, the Enlightenment has a central role to play in the rise of Europe. At the most fundamental level, the Enlightenment involved a change in the way people looked at the world around them. So rather than seeing the world as driven solely by heavenly forces, magic, or fate, intellectuals and eventually wider society began to look at the world around them through a more scientific lens. They believed that nature followed scientific laws and that we should be going out in the world and seeking to discover and understand those scientific laws. Now, this change in mindset made continued technological progress possible, And to understand why, I think it's useful to think of a couple of examples. Now, for our first example, I want you to suppose that the local church roof was to collapse. And if we think of how people might have interpreted that before the Enlightenment, they might have responded by claiming that this was punishment from above, perhaps for a bad sermon from the vicar last Sunday. And their response might be to sack the vicar. Now, that's not going to be the most productive response. If instead people see the world around them in a scientific light, they will interpret that event as being a result of failed construction and engineering techniques. They will seek to make progress in those techniques, and the result will be improvements technologically in science. Let's look at another example, a disease outbreak in a particular part of the world. Now, unenlightened individuals might again interpret that as punishment and might respond to that by, let's say, banning parties and alcohol. Enlightened individuals, by contrast, will interpret it as the outbreak of perhaps a new virus or bacteria that we haven't yet known about, and they will attempt to understand that virus or bacteria, perhaps develop a vaccine that will help prevent the event happening again. So you can see here, if we interpret the world around us in a scientific light, it makes continued progress possible. Without that scientific lens through which to see the world, it's difficult to imagine how we could learn from our mistakes or from events around us in a way that facilitates improvements in our understanding of science, and with it, to lay the foundation for improvements in technology and the wider economy. Now, not only did the Enlightenment make progress possible in this way by ushering in this new scientific mindset, it also made progress desirable. Now, today we take for granted that material progress, such as improvements in life expectancy and technologies that make work less arduous, are a good thing. But according to Mokia, that wasn't necessarily the case before the modern age. Before the Enlightenment, one could argue that the central view of life for the majority of people was simply to accept one's position in society and to behave in a way that would facilitate passage to the afterlife. That might include prayers, fasting, and perhaps doing something other than spending 24 hours a day working hard and inventing. In Mokia's language, the aim was to be good and not necessarily to be happy and to accumulate riches. After the Enlightenment, however, people began to strive for improvement in the present life, to put more weight on the present life, and in a more materialistic sense. Material fulfillment was no longer seen as in opposition to other goals in life, such as religious goals. Indeed, striving to make a better life for one's children and grandchildren was seen as something to be proud of. Now, to Mokia, the Enlightenment is the elephant in the room that historians have been neglecting in their explanation of the rise of Europe, in part because it's easy to forget that before the modern day, people might have looked at the world in a different way, might not have looked at the world in a scientific way, and might not have valued material progress in the way that we do today. Now, with this change in mindset making progress both possible and desirable, there was a real effort amongst intellectuals to try and make progress happen. Enlightened individuals started to work together to improve society. And nothing is more evident of this than the increasing number of societies that began to form in Europe in the 17th and 18th century, including geographic societies, meteorological societies, medical societies, scientific societies, and agricultural societies. Scientists shared knowledge between themselves and began to diffuse it to the general public through the medium of publishing. And with this, what Mokia terms public knowledge, dots could be joined, needless repetition avoided, and connections formed between different ideas, all of which helped to increase the knowledge base of the economy. The dissemination and sharing of this knowledge helped to bring together three important parties. First of all, your intellectual with the scientific idea. Secondly, your craftsperson who had the mechanical knowledge to turn an idea into a working machine. And thirdly, entrepreneurs who had an eye for profit, who could potentially see the value in using a machine in the production process. Without all three sets of people coming together, scientists, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs, even if progress is being made technologically and scientifically, it can remain trapped in the ivory towers and never makes its way out to impact the wider economy. Now, according to Mokia, Britain was at a particular advantage in this regard. She had a well-developed skill base. She had lots of workers with skills in, for example, clockmaking that understood gearing, and that was all useful for the development of mechanical machinery. She also had scientists who tended to be more practical, less abstract than some of those on the continent. And as a result of this more practical, applied nature of science, those scientists were keen to engage with the wider public. And so we see many of the London-based scientific societies giving public lectures, including, for example, the Royal Institution's Christmas lectures that are still an important part of the Christmas calendar today. Now, when you think about it, in many ways, the Enlightenment brought the very opposite of a market system to science. It was a more cooperative and communal scientific research spirit in which ideas were openly and freely distributed, and scientists worked together not for financial reward, but for recognition, out of curiosity, to push forward the frontier of knowledge, and for the common good of society. The emergence of this communal system brought a number of significant advantages over a purely market-dominated system in science. Not only did it allow ideas to spread and successfully bring minds together in a way that was more likely to lead to results, it also allowed avenues to be explored which might, in the market's judgment, initially have seemed unprofitable, but which could lead to unexpected advances later on. So the Enlightenment created what an economist would call the supply-side conditions for scientific and technological change. It gave the economy a scientific capability. However, according to Robert Allen, this wasn't enough by itself. If scientific research is to impact the economy at the ground level, where production is actually taking place, it's necessary for businesses to have an incentive to use technology in their production process. So in particular, firms need to have an incentive to save on labour costs, to want to replace labour with machines that embody new technologies. And of course, if wages are very low, there may be little incentive to use scientific advance in a way that mechanises the production process. And those technologies will remain trapped in the ivory towers, or perhaps we should call them ivory laboratories, with little effect on the ground level where economic growth is actually happening. According to Allen, what was special about the northwest of Europe, and as we saw earlier, was that wages remained high after that shock of the Black Death, which, according to him, stimulated the development of labour-saving machinery, providing firms with an incentive to invest in such machinery in an effort to lower costs. Now, in addition to having high wages, Britain also possessed another advantage which pushed in the same direction, and that was cheap coal, which made the kinds of machinery that Britain was inventing relatively cheap to run. So you have both a high cost of labour and a low cost to running machinery. Now, it's easy to see where the coal came from, but to understand where those high wages came from, we need to turn back the clock to the 14th century, to that Black Death. So as I said earlier, in 1348, the population in Europe witnessed a spectacular collapse, one of the biggest demographic shocks in history. The Black Death had arrived on board all of those trading ships that were spinning across Europe, resulting in between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population losing their lives. Now, as has recently been argued by Tyner de Moor and Jan Luton van Zanden, whilst the plague had devastating effects on many of those living at the time, it also helped to place northwestern Europe on a higher growth plane that would pay off in the centuries that followed. The Black Death, as we saw, created a shortage of workers, in response to which those wages rose. Higher wages meant that where job opportunities actually existed, where you could go into the labour market and be paid a wage, then you could benefit. You're in a position to benefit, whether that be in farming, in domestic service, or in early manufacturing. Now, the result was that younger people could now earn enough to support themselves, and this had a particularly large effect on young women. Perhaps for the first time in history, and after centuries of being seen as a financial burden, with girls being married off at as young an age as possible, teenage girls and young women now had the ability to earn enough to financially support themselves. And this economic freedom dramatically changed women's lives, and also with it, the structure of families. With their newfound economic freedom, women could now choose for themselves whether to marry, who to marry, and when to marry, free from parental interference. They entered the workforce and waited to marry until they found someone of their own choosing. So very different to the traditional system in which girls are married off at a young age, perhaps expected to move into the family home of the groom, producing child after child and looking after the extended family under the watchful gaze of the mother-in-law. Women instead now had the financial freedom to work, and they waited until they found the right man for themselves. And once they did so, they saved up with their partner until they could afford to set up their own independent household. To set up house, or what we would call settle down. Their newfound economic freedom meant they had no intention of moving back in with either of the two parties' parents. Now, the result was young people working, saving, and waiting to start families until they were able to support any children that would soon come along. And so women were now starting to get married later in life. Since women were getting married later in life, they tended to have smaller families than ever before. Fewer new mouths to feed meant less pressure on food and raw materials in the economy, which helped to maintain that higher wage, that higher standard of living that set in after the Black Death, maintaining that incentive for mechanisation highlighted by Robert Allen. Now, in addition to maintaining that high wage and underwriting that incentive for mechanisation, this girl power also brought two other significant advantages for the economy. With smaller families and higher wages, parents could now better afford to educate their children. So as we know, education wasn't free. You had to pay to educate or apprentice your children. Those smaller families and higher wages meant that parents were in a better position to do that, and that helped to provide a growing skill base for the economy. In the context of Mockier's enlightenment theory, this therefore helped to ensure sufficient craft skills in northwestern Europe to enable those intellectual ideas to be turned into practical machines that firms could use at the ground level. Now, the second additional effect of this girl power is that as people could no longer rely on being looked after in their old age by their children, like themselves, their children would also fly the nest and live an independent life, people had to save for their retirement. And that greater investment to save provided a greater pot of potential investment funds for the economy. So we have a high wage that incentivises mechanisation, we have a growing skill base, and we have increasing savings and investment. And all of that added up to create the conditions required to push the northwest of Europe ahead of southern Europe, and with it to push Europe ahead of the east for the very first time in history. Now, of course, the changes to women's power didn't go without resistance. In fact, in the century or so after the Black Death, many in society, perhaps men, responded by trying to restrict women's freedom, such as by limiting their rights to borrow and spend. However, the economic forces pushing women forward could not be resisted forever, and by the 16th century, it's clear that these early feminists had won the battle, or at least the first of many battles. In fact, you might be surprised by just how late in life women were getting married in Britain in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, indicating that a significant change had indeed taken place. That age was remarkably close to what we see in the modern day, 25 years old. So in conclusion, the early modern period was a formative period in European and global history. If we want to understand how the West arrived at its current position, after millennia of playing second fiddle to the East. We need to consider the centuries running up to the British Industrial Revolution, and so the early modern period. Traditionally, economic historians have argued that what was special about this period was the development of markets. Political revolutions supposedly resulted in a growing role for the market, which incentivized investment and innovation, culminating in the British Industrial Revolution and the start of modern economic growth. However, recent research has revealed that markets had much longer historical roots and were present outside of Europe. If markets had been enough to spark the rise of the West and modern economic growth, then growth would have set in much sooner and also would have set in outside of Europe. Instead, what stands out about this period of history is the birth of modern science, and that, when combined with the first feminist wave taking place in northwestern Europe from the 14th century, created both the supply and the demand side conditions required to increase mechanization in the economy, to increase the scientific base, to increase technological change, and with it, to allow Europe to eclipse the East for the first time. As Europe began to industrialize, the East deindustrialized, and the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Victoria, for this characteristic combination of the long view, the broad sweep, and the study in depth. There's always a big debate among historians between two kinds of historians, between those who observe these economic phenomena and then draw the conclusion that people change their ways of thought as a result of these economic phenomena, and the kind of historian who thinks that well, the economy changed because people decided to think about the world in a different way. Thoughts, therefore, changing the world, or the world changing because of thoughts. Now, I might be right in thinking, by talking about the Enlightenment in the way that you do, you rather think that it all happened because people decided to think in a different way. Would I be right in saying that?
Not my view, Joel Mockyer's view.
Yeah.
Yes.
But your view of the Enlightenment would argue, or your account of the Enlightenment would argue that you think that
the fundamental thing that Joel Mockyer is really getting at is that shift in our mindset. That we have in the modern world a very scientific way of looking at the world around us. So we see the world not as driven by fate, magic, and heavenly forces, but by scientific law. And as I say, we value material progress, improvements in life expectancy, that of course put more distance between us and the afterlife, we see as a good thing. And increasing our riches, raising our incomes, we also see as a good thing, and not something that's necessarily detrimental to other religious goals in life. And in Mockyer's view, this is not something that we shouldn't take for granted. This is something that didn't always exist. There was a time in the past when we might have thought very differently.
Yes. So this creates a world in which we now live, in which people assume and talk about economic growth as being desirable. It should be the goal of policy, should be the goal of governments. Lots of questions arise from these observations. Yes, yes, a forest of hands. And can I ask you to give us your name?
My name is Rudy Bogni. I'm not sure whether I misunderstood one of your comments, but I seem to understand that you were making the cooperative nature of the societies during the Enlightenment as inconsistent with markets, which I think would be bad news for funding scientific research.
I can come back on that. Shall I?
Please.
Yes, yes.
Because, you know,
well, let me tell you why I put it that way. For a long time now, economic historians have put a lot of emphasis on patents, which is the market-based solution to science. So what patents do is to provide property rights for inventors. They allow inventors to sell their ideas, and so patents create a market in invention. And so patents are the market solution. by giving inventors a patent, allowing them to capture more of the rewards of their invention. The idea is that that drives them to do more inventing, which is good for society. Now, of course, I think that has a role to play. You know, we wouldn't be where we are today without patents, but my point is that that is not the only thing, that we can't just run ourselves on the basis of a patent system, because what might at first seem unprofitable to someone operating in a market might later turn out to be very profitable. And unless we have, for example, the state funding of science, then avenues would not be open and explored that turn out to be important. So I think you need scientists working together, publicly funded, working together cooperatively to open new avenues, and then of course your patent system kicks in to make sure that we run down those avenues as fast as we can and exploit them to the fullest potential. Now, the other thing that I found when speaking to scientists, colleagues in Cambridge, is that what motivates them is actually very different to what economists assume motivates people. So economists assume that we're motivated purely by money, and so what's driving invention is financial reward. And so a patent system that allows us to capture more financial rewards would be enough to get us inventing. Now, in fact, you speak to high-level scientists, some of the top scientists in the country, and you ask them at the dinner table, why do you do what you do? Money doesn't come into it for 90% of them. What 90% will say is they have a curiosity about the world. They want to discover something that no one else has discovered before. They want to push forward the frontiers of knowledge. Or it might be that someone in their family has suffered from a dreaded disease, and they want to come up with a cure that can prevent people suffering in the future. So I think what drives many scientists is something very different to what economists assume drives people. And those motives can be better served by combining a state-funded scientific system that really began or was an outcome of the Enlightenment and a patent system. Thank you.
Yes, at the back there, Jordan. The gentleman right at the back, and then you.
My question is this. You talk about the link between the East and the West being critical for the wealth of Southern Europe, and mention Constantinople. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that between the fall of Constantinople and Lepanto, you had 130 years of war in the Eastern Mediterranean. Did that reduce the value of the link with the East, and if so, did that have an impact on the wealth of Mediterranean Europe?
I mean, that would be a question better posed to our previous speaker, David Abelafia. But I mean, certainly the trade that Southern Europe was doing with the East was a very important part of the activity taking place there. It obviously wasn't the only thing going on, but it was an important driver and had spillover effects on the rest of the economy. So that Europeans had the potential to import those goods from the East. Obviously, they needed to develop things to exchange in return. And so that trade with the East did create an incentive for the development of, manufacturing sectors, to incentivize Italian traders to go out in the rest of Europe, carve out trade routes with the rest of Europe to bring back metals, wool, back into the Mediterranean and out into the East. So suddenly, trade with the East wasn't the only factor, but certainly I think it stimulated a lot of activity that might not have been there otherwise.
It's fair to say that a really well-run government machine can find war and the making of war a fantastic source of economic innovation and scientific advance, collective enterprise in that way. Yes, the gentleman there, and then behind you.
Thank you. Richard Barron. I'm curious as to the economic mechanism immediately around the time of the Black Death, because I suppose one possibility would be you shrink the population by a third, you shrink the economy by a third, nothing else changes, the numbers, the wages and so on don't change. That's obviously what didn't happen. Yes. And I wonder what it was. Was it that labour base shrank but capital base didn't? Was it that you no longer used the marginal land, you could use only the good land? What was going on there?
Yeah. So the demand for labour remains and is unaffected.
Yes. So your two key resources are land, which is not perfectly fixed, as you say, there is marginal land, but fixed, relatively fixed, and labour. So what you have is a shrinkage of your labour relative to that land, and that makes land relatively less valuable and labour relatively more valuable. If you think about it also in terms of a labour market context, the demand for labour and the supply of labour, well, an economist would say that the demand for labour comes out of the productivity in the economy in terms of the technological productivity of the economy. And so we can think of that as remaining relatively stable. You know, the technologies that we had before were still in existence. So what you have is a stable demand curve for labour, but a shrinking labour supply curve, the result being that it pushes up the wage. Thank you.
Yes, Mark.
Mark Jones, just a sort of historical question. In France, you have great Enlightenment thinkers.
Absolutely.
You have a long Atlantic seaboard.
Absolutely.
You have a massive population that could be a market.
Yes.
Why not France?
Well, I think that, I mean, the French geography is very different to Dutch and English geography. So whilst you have a long coastline, you also have a great internal expanse that's relatively cut off from that coastline. Whilst you might not believe it, I'm from Manchester, I'm used to hilly terrain. Whilst you might not believe it, if you measure the average height above sea level, it's much higher in somewhere like France than it is in Britain and the Netherlands. And so the result was that you had internal markets developing earlier on in places like the Netherlands and England than you did in places like France. So whilst there might have been a lot of coastal trade, there were lots of relatively inaccessible cut-off regions. Now, what's particularly important in terms of the feminist, the girl power argument of Van Zanden and de Moor is labour markets, and so people being able to move around the economy. And that's much easier in England and Holland than it is in France. So that Black Death, that shock of the Black Death, is something that hits all of Europe. But what you need is to have enough job opportunities available for people to be able to move around, to find work, to get access to the market wage for it to have an effect. Now, coming back to your point about the Enlightenment, I absolutely agree that in many ways the French economy was perhaps more enlightened than the English economy, and certainly Scotland was more enlightened than the English economy. But remember, it's not just the change in the scientific base, it's also the demand for using technologies in the economy. And what we have in England is, whilst we might have had a scientific base that might have been growing a little bit more slowly than France, what we had were those high wages that meant any technological discoveries that were happening, there was a real incentive to apply them, to find applications for firms to try and embody them in machines.
There's a gentleman there who's been waiting for a while. Yes.
Harold Carter. Victoria,
Hello.
Hello. I'm interested, I want you to say a bit more about the Black Death and why it has a differential effect on women's earnings and the European marriage pattern in the Northwest, because there are a number of countries in the Northwest with reasonably good internal communication. But then Italy, of course, it's pretty easy to move between cities in Italy and so on. And you don't have particular centralised or autocratic government. So that I find it an implausible explanation.
Well, I still do think that the geographic terrain issue is a big one. Again, you measure height above sea level in Italy. It's much bigger than England and Holland. You have those vast mountainous interiors with lots of villages, lots of people living in those regions that really can't easily access a dynamic labour market in the way that they can in the UK and in the Netherlands. And when you look at, for example, labour force participation rates, those that are working for a wage, it's well above 50% in the northwest of Europe. Now, of course, this, the Black Death is unlikely to be the sole factor that's changing the European marriage pattern, but it's certainly an exogenous factor that's coming along. And we always have, as economic historians, this difficulty of distinguishing the chicken and the egg. What came first? Was it society that changed first? Was it the economy that changed first? Or was it the other way around? And the Black Death was very much an exogenous factor, where we don't have that chicken and egg situation. And so if we're searching for exogenous fundamental causes, then I do think it deserves the weight that it's been given.
Yes, gentleman there.
Hi, Victoria. It's
Hello.
very nice to see you. Tamas Vanyó from the other sea.
And your name, first of all.
Yeah, Tamas Vanyó from the other sea. I would follow on briefly Harold Carter's point, talking about the Black Death. What we see in the Black Death is that in Italy, the population shock is actually bigger than in the northwest of Europe.
Yeah.
And we not only don't see the similar dynamic in the marriage pattern, but we don't see the similar dynamic in real wages in the following centuries. Despite the fact that actually the plague comes back to Italy rather than other places several times.
And of course it's so prevalent there because of all of those ships. As I say, the plague travels on those ships, and so it's not surprising that Italy is hit hard.
I was surprised that you didn't bring up one obvious alternative explanation for the little divergence within Europe, and that goes back to the Weber hypothesis.
Yes.
Protestantism versus Catholicism. And that, until very recently, it was regarded as an outdated concept.
Yes.
In the last 5 years, we had several big papers in the economics literature trying to link this little divergence back to the Weber thesis.
Yes.
The return to Weber, worth pausing there and perhaps saying to the broad audience what Weber said very quickly.
Yes, so this is the Protestant ethic, isn't it? The development of Protestantism, the idea that working hard is good for your, not only your health and your income, but for your progress to heaven.
The sense of a vocation and so on.
Yes. Now Weber's hypothesis was, of course, mentioned in Laszlo's paper, one of the seminal papers in the European marriage pattern. But of course, here again, the difficulty is chicken and egg. You know, one way that Laszlo puts it is perhaps these young people, because they now are young women, have this freedom. They're going out to work. They're waiting until they find the right man for them. They're saving along the way before setting up a household. Then that means that young people from very early on in life see the value of working, of saving, because that leads you to be able to marry and to set up your own household. So we do have a chicken and egg question. You know, do we get this exogenous shock of the Black Death that frees women and then leads to greater weight on working, going out into the labour market, working, saving, and then people start to think differently about work and saving, and perhaps that inspires that Protestant work ethic. So it's difficult to disentangle the two, I think, but certainly I'm sure Weber does have a position in this.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Victoria. Mike Howell. One of the things you didn't talk about were the eggs, that is, the savings. And what role does savings play in the accumulation process? Because it's certainly something that Keynes mentioned. He talks about, I think, Drake robbing the Spanish of gold being a sort of catalyst for British capitalism. And of course, Marx in Das Kapital spends an awful lot of time talking about the accumulation process.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that early modern capitalism is very different to modern capitalism. So we know if we think about capitalism, it's production for profit. Capitalists own the capital. Employers employ labour to work that capital. And in the early modern period, what we had were quite small firms owned by just a few individuals, competing with each other to lower costs, using technologies that then might have been capital intensive, but certainly wouldn't be capital intensive today. Whereas today what we have are large firms, often owned by many people through the stock market, by potentially thousands of people, with limited liability that makes investing in them less risky than it was before, operating on a global stage. And so I think when we think about early modern capitalism, it is quite different to modern capitalism. The capital requirement that firms had was much smaller then than it is today. And that meant that saving and investment was relatively less important than it was today, although of course you did need some funds to facilitate the investment that was taking place. I mean, when you look at the development of Britain's financial sector, what's interesting is you see the development of country banks, of regional banks that really take off in the 18th century. But many of the parts of the country that go on to industrialise and develop are actually not necessarily where those country banks are. Many of your early capitalists are developing as a result of ploughing back their own profits. They get access to working capital from the banking system, but they certainly don't get access to long-term loans in the way that we do today. So I think whilst in the modern day, you know, firms will frequently go to banks, ask for long-term loans, go to the stock market, issue stocks, have these thousands of stockholders helping them to fund their investments. It was actually quite different in the past, and even someone like Niall Ferguson in his book The Ascent of Money argues that financial markets were not as important for Britain's industrial revolution as we think it was. And so I think really, the two key effects that I would want to emphasise of this girl power are that the high wages that provides an incentive to mechanise, and the growing skill base of the economy that gives those skilled workers with mechanical skills to actually develop those technologies.
Yes, Ed.
Thank you. Ed Salazar. Thank you for taking an extraordinarily complex period and creating a chain of events that I find entirely plausible and easy to understand, and also introducing the ideas and the influences of Protestant ethic and the Enlightenment. That's very, very critical to this. But I remember that you started at the beginning explaining how very important the East was to this complex chain of development. But I wonder if, in the context of comparing the development of the northwest of Europe to the other economies, the Mediterranean and Middle East, would you say that it grew and it prospered at the expense of the other economies?
That's a very good question. Now, of course, economists like to see there as not as being a fixed pie, that if one person takes a bigger slice, someone else has to take a smaller slice. Economists like to see it as we can grow the size of the pie. So just because someone else is getting a larger slice doesn't necessarily mean that someone else's slice will shrink. And so answering that with my economist hat on, then of course I would say that Europe could grow without putting the East at a disadvantage. But what we do know is, as I say, the East did deindustrialize as Europe industrialized. And so we replaced those fancy Chinese porcelain. Why do we call porcelain China? Because originally it came from China. We replaced that with wedgwood. You know, we replace carpets coming from Turkey with Axminster carpets. We replace calicos coming from India with our own homespun cotton goods. And so what happens is, as Europe becomes, or as the northwest of Europe becomes ever more productive, it's able to lower its costs, push down prices of its goods, and so put out of business those eastern firms and come to capture all of those customers that had previously been flocking to the east. So it is, I think, clear when we look at it in those terms that Europe progressing did mean that the East deindustrialized. Now, of course, Europe is being challenged today by China. You know, we've come full circle, in a sense. And now we face a similar problem. China's industrializing. Are we deindustrializing in response? And I think the answer is that you have to then find another way. You have to find something that you can do that is suited to the particular God-given or otherwise resources and skills that your economy has. Which brings me back to putting that economist hat on and saying that really there is room for us all to grow and to trade successfully with each other, and that we shouldn't view it as a single pie, that if one country takes a bigger slice, that's somehow going to make others poorer.
Sort of presupposes something static rather than dynamic. Yes, Mark, you wanted to come back. Yeah.
Sorry, I got France out of the way, but the thing I'm really interested to ask. So, the Weber theory looks at Calvinism.
Yeah.
A lot of what you've said is about a sort of scientific development.
Yes.
But that goes hand in hand with another development in European theology
Yes.
towards liberal Protestantism.
Right.
And to what extent is what happens in Britain and the Netherlands connected with developments of liberal politics that are closely rooted,
Yeah.
not so much in homo economicus
Yeah.
and a really rather reductionist utilitarian view of what human beings are, but a set of values,
Yes.
a set of ways of governing companies, thinking about sharing out profits.
Yes.
Can you comment on that, please?
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting question, and the way economists tend to answer that question is to say that the law and liberal values come first, and once you have those, then the economy can grow. But what's interesting about this period, and as has been pointed out in a now quite seminal paper by Asimoglu, Johnson and Robinson, is to some extent what we saw was the economy commercializing, that leading merchants to put greater pressure on the state for changes in things like the law, to see the value in replacing an unelected monarch with an elected parliament that could better serve their interests. And so I think inevitably there's going to be a two-way interchange between the law and liberal values and the economy. But what we should certainly resist doing is saying that unless you have the law and the liberal values first, your economy can't grow. You know, in fact, your economy can start to grow, and as it starts to grow, that will develop forces that will push in the direction of greater commercial law and greater rights for merchants, changes in systems of governance.
Yes.
Thank you. You talked about agricultural productivity, but you didn't talk about weather patterns in Europe during that period. And
The Little Ice Age.
You didn't talk about slave trade either.
Yes.
We do have a big event on the slave trade coming up at the beginning of July, which we'll be advertising later on.
Yes, I think I might leave this slave trade to then. Certainly, I think that the Little Ice Age was, we know it was happening. And it is something, in fact, that when I've been crunching my own numbers and coming up with estimates of market development for Europe in this period, that I've looked closely at measures of climate and tried to see if there is any correlation between what's happening to climate and the level of market development in different parts of Europe, say the Netherlands versus France versus Italy. Now, I've actually found it very difficult to find a correlation. Once you throw in all of the other factors that are going on, all of the other changes that are going on, then you find that climate doesn't look as important as you might at first think it is. But that might be, of course, because whilst in some ways you might say I'm looking at a big period from, my work has focused on the period from about 1350 to 1900, you might in some ways say that's a big period. But of course, compared with the millennia of time that we've had, that's not a big period. And I do suspect that if we extended the data set, further back in time, I think then we would start to see that climate does have an important role to play. And there were some, similarly interesting changes happening in ancient times between the ancient and the medieval period. So I don't want to completely put down that hypothesis, but I just want to say for this particular period of history that I've looked at, I haven't been able to find a close connection.
This is the long early modern period.
Yes, the long early modern period, yes.
As you said earlier, conventional accounts of these matters rather stress the rise in the belief in limited governments, constitutional governments, so on and so on and so on. But many of the most kind of dynamic features of economic advance during this period, and in England, presupposes really rather an activist view of government and a belief in active government. And that is what makes the system of protectionism known as mercantilism so attractive. It seems completely weird now. England, supposedly the home of markets and constitutional advance, should have devoted so much attention to this notion of mercantilism and to dominate the idea that you've got to grab as much of the species and deny to everybody. And then when it comes to the role of the executive, I mean, I think of those very interesting capitalist entrepreneurs Charles II in the 1660s, and his brother James, Duke of York, future James II, I mean, bad King James, as it were, sort of Catholic and absolutist, who established the Royal African Company.
Yes.
They had a very, very clear view of the role of the state and of government as bringing together scientific exploration and market advance and using the powers of government in that way. But a word about how on earth could anybody have believed in mercantilism, I wonder?
Well, if you look at the mercantilist writings, for example, Thomas Munn's work in the middle of the 17th century, there's very much an acceptance within Britain that Britain is a backwater at that time, that the big traders in the world are Italy and increasingly the Dutch. And there was a real sense in which Britain wanted to try and copy the successes that those economies had, and felt that it couldn't do it without the help of the state. So the idea of carving out the colonies, of enforcing any goods that come out of those colonies to come back into the UK before being re-exported, that helped to develop the port cities. So we see a big stimulus to the development of port cities like London and Bristol in the 17th and 18th century. You have all of these ships coming in from the colonies that are creating, demand for metal to go into anchors, demand for fabrics to go into sailors' uniforms, workers to repackage goods, insurance industries, and so on. Ultimately, of course, it takes both the state and the market to have a successful economy. And what we've seen in the 20th century is really both extremes. We've seen the extreme of 100% state, and that didn't work very well. Perhaps we've gone too much in the direction of free markets, and that's brought some problems. And it's about trying to find the right balance between the two, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria, for striking the right balance in coming to us this evening. And it's quite a feat to maintain the equipoise as you have introduced us to this very extensive tapestry that stretches not just from England and the Kingdom of England to the United Provinces, but really across the continent of Europe and its northwest, across over 4 centuries, and thereby making sense of the detail while elucidating the general arguments with such success and grace and style. We thank you very much indeed for delivering the lecture so very much in the spirit of this institute and the spirit of this course. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen.